can say
All
hello.
right.
We're live now. We're live now to a
Everybody.
massive audience. It's Dimitri Lascaris, everybody. Dimitri, thanks for going on. I'm glad we could do this. I had a bit of a tricky time scheduling this. We're crossing the Atlantic here.
My
And,
apologies for my screw up, Rob.
no problems. No problem. It happens.
Yeah.
It
Thank you.
happens.
Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no, we're happy to have you. So Dimitri, you first kind of popped on my radar. I guess it was around 2 years ago when you were running for the Green Party leadership, and I would like to talk to you a bit more about that process maybe later on. But that's when I started kind of following the work that you were doing. I actually joined the Green Party briefly to vote to vote for you for the leadership.
Oh, thank you so much, Rob.
Because
I had no idea. Thank
yeah.
you so much. I appreciate that.
I'm not like really super crazy about the Green Party as a sort of political organization, but I liked the idea of having someone in the leadership that maybe had more of a bold vision about where the Green Party should be going, and especially in terms of foreign policy, which we don't hear a lot from the Green Party. So I've been following your work since that time, and so I saw that you were...
Can I just interrupt you one thing? I think you and I, were you on the Freedom Flotilla in 2018?
No, I was not.
You never participated in the Freedom Flotilla?
No, I've
Okay.
covered these things and talked about them, but no.
I had it in my head that you and I were on a boat at some point, but that must have been some other Rob Rousseau.
I would like to be on a boat with you. I would be happy to do that in the future at some point, but...
I hope we get the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. But so I wanted to touch base with you, Dimitri, because I saw that you had just gone on this kind of trip. I saw you spending time in Crimea and Russia. You've been very outspoken about the Russian-Ukraine conflict and Canada's role in kind of like promoting that and prolonging it and expressing a viewpoint that's not exactly very popular in our discourse. So I was just wondering if you could let us know, about this trip you went on, what made you want to go to Crimea and Russia and spend time there, and kind of what your thoughts are at this time after a year and a half of this conflict going on, and after you've got a chance to spend some time actually in the region, which not a lot of the people that are commenting on this actually have done.
Look, it's not particularly complicated. I mean, one can disagree with my view about all of this, but to understand why I went there, why I have been so focused on this war, so outspoken about this war, all you need to know really is that I think we're living through the most dangerous moment in human history. We are in a hot war with a nuclear armed state. Things never got to this point during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We never got to the point of sending active members of our military and former members of our military who were trained by our military to assist in waging war against Russia, or actually participating on the front line in combat against Russian forces. We never got to the point of flooding a country that was on Russia's border with the most lethal weaponry in our arsenals, at least conventional weaponry, and then using our surveillance assets to provide real-time battlefield intelligence to those proxy forces that are using NATO weaponry to assist them to kill Russians and destroy Russian infrastructure, and even to launch attacks on Russian soil. It never got to that point. We are well beyond the threshold of danger that we achieved, or that we arrived at the peak moment of crisis in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in my opinion. And what makes this even more dangerous is that it's happening in the context of a climate crisis that's spinning out of control. The only hope we have to manage that crisis, I mean, at this stage, we're not going to resolve it anytime soon, but at least to get to the point where we can manage it in a way that doesn't undermine organized human civilization, we will need an unprecedented level of international cooperation for that to happen. Something we haven't experienced, certainly not in the post-World War II period. And we're heading in the opposite direction, largely because of this war. We are actually seeing a rapid deterioration in international cooperation. The world is dividing essentially into two blocks, one led by the United States, the other by China and Russia. And I see absolutely no prospect of us dealing responsibly with the climate crisis in the current conditions. My message to you, if you're a climate activist, you're an environmental activist, is you can forget about solving any ecological emergency of a global scale unless we first bring an end to this war. And the way we do that is through negotiation, and we have to have a dialogue with our, the belligerents who are deemed by our elites to be the enemy. We have to engage them in a dialogue, and so that's why I went to Russia. That's why I've been so outspoken about this. This is why I've lost so much sleep over this war. I think we're sleepwalking into World War III, Rob.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the ways that we're kind of moving away from the idea of international cooperation and forming these kind of separate blocks, I think a lot of people just point to Russia and China as being the reason for that and point to their belligerence and kind of ignore our own role in creating that situation. And I think when you go back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and you're talking about, Canada or the US's or NATO's role in arming and funding the one side of this war, I think what gets lost a lot of the time in these conversations, especially in the West, you hear this elsewhere around the world, but when we talk about it here, we pretend that our involvement started in 2022, which is not at all accurate, right? Canada and the United States have been arming and funding these militia groups in Eastern Ukraine now for like going on a decade now. And it's been a really kind of inconvenient truth over the last year and a half to acknowledge that. And we like to pretend that this is some kind of like black and white, good versus evil storyline. And we're just pitching in to help the plucky underdog defend themselves. But it's a really kind of like childish and distorted view of the way this has actually developed and the way that we've kind of encouraged this entire situation over the last decade.
Yeah, the superficiality, the shallowness of Western discourse around this war is astonishing, frankly. I mean, it's not just that we were arming those militias, of course. We as in our governments, and particularly the U.S. government, Victoria Nuland, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, Jeffrey Pyatt, Senator John McCain, now deceased, and many others from the U.S. political elite, aggressively interfered in Ukrainian politics in 2014 with a view to orchestrating, encouraging, affecting the overthrow of a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. And whatever one may say about him, Western observers, international election observers, agreed in 2010 that he was democratically elected. And his sin was that he wanted to maintain good relations with Russia. For that, he was deemed by the West to be a Putin puppet. And no one ever talks about the fact that the vast majority of Yanukovych's support in the 2010 election came from the areas of Ukraine where there's a high concentration of Russian speakers and people who are ethnically Russian, and areas which historically, for a good long time, had belonged to Russia. It's not surprising that these people wanted to have good relations with Russia. They shouldn't have been, deprived of their vote, which is effectively what happened when Yanukovych was overthrown. And we've gotten into these silly debates about whether it was a coup or not a coup. I mean, look, at the end of the day, whatever word we attach to it, no rational human being looking at the evidence would say that we did not aggressively interfere in Ukrainian politics at that time. Yeah. And that we were, aggressively seeking to have him replaced by somebody who was a Ukrainian nationalist and hostile to Russia. That's absolutely clear. So, who's the aggressor here at the end of the day? I think that that's a real question that we ought to be debating in an open and transparent manner, rather than trying to shut down dissenting viewpoints, especially when there's so much at stake.
Yeah, and an interesting wrinkle about that as well with Yanukovych that also is not really talked about a lot is like not only was he more neutral, not openly hostile to Russia, but also was in the had turned down a loan from the IMF to go to Russia to get a better deal on cheaper gas coming from Russia, which immediately led to these, just a few months later, these widespread protests that led to this pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Western replacement. And right. Again, that's something that we don't really talk about in this context.
Nor do we talk about the laws that were adopted by that pro-EU Russophobic regime, which abridged the language rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. We don't talk about the fact that dozens of pro-Russian activists were burned alive in the trade union building in Odessa in 2014. by neo-Nazi groups and ultranationalists, and that no one was held accountable for that. We don't talk about that at all. So, as I say, our discourse is just extraordinarily shallow, superficial. And I got to tell you, Rob, my greatest disappointment over the past year is to see how few people on the left, people I know to be genuine, sincere leftists and progressives in this country and elsewhere in the West, have been able to summon the courage intellectually and morally to speak out about this war and to see the reality of what is happening. I'm really disappointed. I have to say that. And there have been, a number of honorable people like yourself in the progressive community who are willing to have an honest and rational discussion about all of this. But there are not enough of us at this particular point in time, and that's frightening.
No, it is. I mean, it's been a really toxic climate for trying to have a nuanced conversation about this. And, I understand. I share your disappointment in a lot of this as well. And I think the failure of people on the left to talk about this has opened up space on the right to have these kind of right-wing demagogues like Tucker Carlson, for example, making these arguments which I think are pretty compelling to some people. So I think it's been a huge failure. It's been a huge failure, but it's been a really horrible climate to speak about these things. And to an extent, I understand why people become really reticent to speak out about it, because when you do try to even talk about Russia's perspective in any way, or try to inject any kind of nuance at all, or talk about, the role of Canada or the US or NATO in promoting this or prolonging it, I mean, it's just, there's this entire kind of propaganda machine that will come after you and target you and call you all sorts of things. They say you support genocide and war crimes and you're a Putinist or whatever it is. And people become really paralyzed, I think, in this kind of really toxic climate where only one viewpoint in our media is really promoted or allowed to be articulated. And anyone that kind of deviates from that is framed as being some kind of radical or extremist. And I kind of understand, even though I do find it a little disappointing, why some people, even if they don't, at the very least, will just say nothing about it because they're worried about how it's going to affect their reputation, how it's going to affect their career prospects. It can be really damaging to have these kind of things floating around out there about you.
Absolutely. I think that's an entirely valid point. I recognize that. When I talk about my disappointment, I'm really not focusing my commentary on the many people within the progressive community who, if they spoke out about it, would be potentially harmed reputationally in terms of their employment whatsoever, whatever it may be, in ways that they themselves are not in a position to manage, to deal with, so whatever economic reason, they may be confronted by economic constraints, which I'm not subject to. So I'm not referring to those people. I understand why they would be reticent to speak out.
I still do find it disappointing, but it's just,
absolutely. But it's understandable. Well, the people I'm really upset about is, first of all, those people in the progressive community who can withstand the heat and are willing to take that heat in other contexts, for example, defending Palestinian rights or condemning, attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government, replace it with Juan Guaido, something which fortunately failed. They're willing to stand the heat in those contexts, but not in this context. And even worse, the people I'm really worked up about, to be frank about it, are the people who join in the reputational destruction. They actually will come after you on social media and they'll call you a Putin. People who used to support me are doing that. And I'm astonished by this. I mean, okay, you don't want to speak out. You don't want to take the heat. I get it. But do you have to make yourself a useful idiot of the Anglo-American empire by coming after people like myself or yourself who are trying to speak some truth about this thing? That's just unacceptable.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, I think it's just it should be sort of a basic thing if you're count yourself to be on the left, to kind of understand what NATO is and what NATO is doing, and to kind of be against that and to push back against it and to push back against these narratives. And the idea of all these kind of leftists and socialists who are not only not speaking out, like I was talking about, but openly promoting NATO and supporting it and saying, oh yeah, we need to NATO is getting it right this one time, we got to back them on this. That to me is pretty bad. It's pretty unacceptable.
I've said this many times, if we can agree on one thing, we on the left, we in the progressive community, we anti-imperialists, It should be that NATO doesn't give a damn about international law or human rights or democracy. They don't even care about those things in their own part of the world, let alone in other parts of the world outside of the NATO jurisdictions. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. Did they care about international law in Iraq? Did they care about it in Libya? Did they care about it in Afghanistan? I mean, when they overthrew the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s, NATO powers, democratically elected president of Iran, did they care about democracy, international law in Chile when Salvador Allende was overthrown? The record of lawlessness and anti-democratic behavior and abuses of human rights of NATO powers is so long that you have to truly live in la la land to think that this war or any war supported by NATO has anything to do with democracy, international law, and human rights. We should at least be able to agree on that much. And if we do agree on that, then the question becomes, what are they really up to over there? What is NATO's real agenda? That's the conversation we should be having. We shouldn't be debating whether or not this is nobly or honorably motivated, because clearly it's not. I mean, you really have to be out to lunch to believe that at this stage. How many times does NATO have to lie to us, the United States government, the Canadian government, about its true foreign policy objectives before we stop believing them?
Yeah, I mean, not only lying to us and engaging in this kind of behavior, but specifically arming and funding proxies in civil wars to destabilize regimes that you don't like. This strategy has been going on for decades. And in the last 10, 15 years in Libya, they've done that. In Syria, and they're then doing it in Ukraine with these proxies there. So it's like, I guess that's where I get a little confused, where I see people just unable to recognize this basic pattern, this strategy of arming and funding these proxies, promoting these conflicts, and then destabilizing regimes with in an effort to get rid of these regimes that you don't like. I mean, this is not a new strategy for NATO, but again, people just have been really confused by this whole thing, and the inability to recognize this, I think, has been strange for me over the last year and a half.
Yeah, and the great tragedy of all of this, assuming we manage to avoid a nuclear war, and by this stage, I think all bets are off on that front. We could very well find ourselves in a nuclear war the way things are going. But in the least awful scenario, Ukraine will end up destroyed. Ukraine's being destroyed before our very eyes. And anyone who thinks that NATO is going to pick up the pieces when this country is left in smoking ruins, did they do that in Afghanistan? Did they stay there and rebuild the country that they destroyed? Did they do that in Libya? Are they going to do that in Syria? Did they do that in Iraq? They're going to leave that country in smoking ruins, and it's going to be, first and foremost, an absolute tragedy for this generation and subsequent generations of Ukrainians. But also that devastation will be an open, festering wound in the heart of Europe for decades to come. A country that has been flooded with weapons, where neo-Nazis have been encouraged to be armed and to wage war, where democracy has basically been torn apart. There's no democracy left in Ukraine anymore. Anybody who looks at the actual behavior of the Zelensky government, I mean, you have to be on planet Mars to think that that's a democratic champion. They've shut down all opposition parties. They've adopted laws, vague, ambiguous laws, which subject people to imprisonment for over a decade because they express sympathy for Russia. They've shut down opposition newspapers, television stations. There's evidence of massive corruption, grand larceny on an epic scale going on right now in Ukraine. And so this is not a democratic government. It is not ultimately serving the interests of the Ukrainian people, and they are going to be the people we're supposed to be helping are the ones who are going to suffer the most because of Western policies towards this war.
Yeah, and these sort of like economic, like the shock doctrine style economic policies are already put into place. So whatever form Ukraine takes afterwards, like this process of like privatization, whatever social safety net was still left over from the Soviet era, that's been dismantled. All sort of remotely left-wing parties. It's just totally primed for this like Western capital penetration, which again is great for the shareholders and stockholders of these corporations that are going to move in there and privatize all the resources and all these like social services. But it's going to be, as it's been everywhere else around the world with this process taking place, it's going to be horrible for the people that actually have to live in this situation.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking
Yeah,
what's being done to that country.
it is. Yeah,
And
and people
we are,
promoting people's
we're in it up to our necks.
yeah, and the main people that are so gung ho about prolonging this have this idea that they're doing it because in the defense of of Ukrainians, when in the reality they're making life worse for the people that actually have to live in that region. That's been a really weird thing for me, seeing people in like Canada and America become so kind of hyped up by this fog of war situation and getting so attached to these like regions in eastern Ukraine and villages that they didn't hear of before weeks and months previous to this. And it's like they feel like they have more of an attachment to these places than the actual people that are living through this situation that didn't have to go through this. It's been very bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. And one question I like to ask is, when I hear people, particularly progressives and leftists, saying I support the arming of Ukraine, do they support sending weapons to the Palestinians to kill Israeli soldiers? I have yet to meet a single leftist or progressive who supports the arming of Ukrainians and who will say publicly or even privately that they support sending weapons to the Palestinians to kill Israeli soldiers. And the mainstream human rights community in the West now acknowledges openly that Israel is an apartheid state. And our government and almost all Western governments for decades have acknowledged that the settlements in the West Bank are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and that Israel is engaged in a range of human rights abuses. It's been going on not for a year and a half, as in the case of the invasion of Ukraine. This has been going on for decades, Rob. Decades. Yeah. Yet no one who supports the arming of Ukrainians will say, I support sending weapons to the Palestinians to kill Israeli soldiers, the occupying soldiers. No one.
Yeah, well, Even if you are against the invasion and you want to talk about the right of Ukrainians under international law, either the moral or the legal right to defend themselves, in this case, then if that's what you believe, and I understand that argument, but if that's what you believe, then on that same level, then the Palestinians do not only have the moral right but the legal right to defend themselves with armed struggle. But as you're pointing out, the same people are not quite as interested in extending this right to the Palestinians. You talked about we talked a little bit of the people that actually have to live in these regions, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to connect with you, because you just recently went to Crimea. That's kind of a big part of this story as well, because after the Euromaidan, you had the Russian annexation of Crimea. And in some of the conversations about ending this Ukrainian conflict, you have this kind of very hardline stance coming from the West saying, like, not only does Russia need to fully leave these eastern regions and immediately withdraw from there, but also Crimea as well. Which, again, I think is a little bit strange, and it's not always really like keeping in mind like what the actual people that live in this region think as well. And as we've talked about it before on this stream, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this, but there's plenty of people in Crimea that are actually quite comfortable with the current situation, that don't want to go back to being part of Ukraine. And we don't really want to hear from these people when we talk about this narrative, like in our media. Do you want to just talk about what your experience was visiting Crimea and actually speaking to some of the people there, and how you think that contrasts with how we talk about this conflict and talk about Crimea and Russia's role there?
Sure. So I was just to put it all in context, I was there for about 11 days in April. I probably spoke to dozens of people when I was there, no more than that. I didn't conduct any kind of a poll, obviously. I was pretty much all over Crimea during those 11 days. I went to Yalta, in the southeastern part of the peninsula. I was in Sevastopol, which is in the southwestern part, and which is the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. I was in the capital, Simferopol of Crimea, which is kind of in the middle. And then I went to the north to the border with Kherson region, and between Crimea and Kherson region, right at the border, and visited a refugee center where people coming from Kherson and other parts of the war zone were being transited out to other areas, refugees, where they could be dealt with socially right now in Crimea and throughout Russia, I think it's fair to say it's a difficult environment in which to speak openly about, sympathetically about the Ukrainian government and its objectives. So again, I'm cognizant of that, but I didn't really have the impression that anybody was, for what it's worth, I didn't have the impression that anybody was saying this to me, was expressing these views out of fear. I had the impression that these people passionately and genuinely felt that this was not in the best interest of their families, their communities, and of the people of Crimea, that it be brought back under the rule of Kiev. At the same time, I didn't really encounter anybody who was hostile to the people of Ukraine. There was tremendous amount of antipathy, shall we say, although it was surprisingly diplomatically expressed a lot of the time towards the government of Ukraine. People did not, obviously, they don't view the government of Ukraine, the people I spoke to, as the legitimate government of Ukraine. They do view it as a coup regime. They do view it as being ultra-nationalist. A lot of people feel it's an outright neo-Nazi regime. They feel that government is acting in ways that are contrary to the interests of ordinary Ukrainians. And, I heard a lot of people express sadness for what's happening to the Ukrainian people. And a sincere wish that government be removed from power and replaced by one that will actually act in their interests. Again, you can disagree or not with what I'm relating to you, but that's what I heard. And the last thing I'll say, sort of summarizing my experience there, there's so much I could say about it, but I think one other highlight of it for me was that I didn't encounter any hostility towards me personally, even though virtually everybody I spoke to had no idea who I was when they met me. They'd never heard of me before. They didn't know what my views were about the Ukraine war. And they knew from the outset that I'm a Canadian. I don't speak Russian. I, speak with an accent from North America. And yet I was expecting hostility. Some, I would be understandable given the, posture our government has taken towards Russia. But I didn't get any of that, which was surprising to me. So I think I came away feeling, there's really no substitute for personal interaction with people. This is the best way to actually understand where they're coming from and to de-escalate conflict, is to personally interact with people. We are taking the wrong approach here. We are trying in the West to literally sever all lines of communication with not just the Russian government, between the Russian government and the Western governments, but between our peoples. This is a terrible mistake. We need to talk to each other, preferably face to face if that's possible.
Yeah, I think you're kind of hitting on something that also just gets completely lost when we talk about this, which is that this idea that, there's always been this hostility and conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is not really true. I mean, I know history has been really revised on this and rewritten, but I think one thing that's been completely forgotten or not ever talked about is this long history of cooperation and friendship between Russia and Ukraine. Even this idea, even though there, as we know, there is this issue with these neo-Nazi ultra-nationalists in Ukraine, the idea that Ukraine is just filled with people that believe in this is not true at all, No. There's this long history of Ukrainians who fought in the Red Army correctly and bravely to defeat fascism in World War II. And I think that's been one of the really disgraceful things over the last year, is the way that legacy is being completely erased and forgotten. And all the statues of these Ukrainian Soviet heroes are being torn down, and the legacy is being replaced by these ultra-nationalists like the Banderas who helped carry out the Holocaust. I think it's a real shame. And this whole narrative about Russia was occupying Ukraine and and the real nationalists were struggling against that. It completely obscures the reality of the last century, really, and about the relationship that Ukraine had with Russia and had with the rest of the Soviet Union. It's been completely ignored and forgotten, which I think is really a shame. Yeah,
within 3 hours of my setting foot in Sevastopol, I visited the memorial to the Soviet soldiers who lost their lives in the defense of Sevastopol during, I believe it was an 8-month brutal siege by the Nazi forces, supported and supplemented by forces from Romania that were fighting alongside the Nazis. I believe it was some 180,000 Soviet soldiers. Obviously, a number of them would have been Ukrainian, were certainly Ukrainian. Many of them were Russians. Others came from other parts of the Soviet Empire, died in the defense of Sebastopol, and it was completely obliterated. Completely obliterated. So when you're living there, a Crimean, and you've emerged out of that historical trauma. And by the way, we all, those of us who know anything about the Second World War, know that this was a pattern that was repeated throughout the Western Soviet Union. Cities were completely obliterated. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people, many of them Ukrainians, a great many of them Russians. For us it's so deeply insulting for us who owe this tremendous debt of gratitude to the peoples of the Soviet Union for contributing and sacrificing so much in the defeat of Nazism, to, basically just spit on that entire legacy. It's deeply insulting and offensive to the Russian people, and that should be easy for us to understand. We shouldn't have. We didn't suffer anything along the lines of that kind of a historical trauma in the defeat of Nazism, those of us in the West. How many Canadian cities were obliterated by the Nazis? How many American cities were obliterated by the Nazis? We lost a tiny fraction of the peoples that the Soviet Union lost. And so it's just disgraceful for us to try to erase that. And it really sends a terrible message to the people of Russia about what our intentions are, that we're not even able to acknowledge that sacrifice by their peoples anymore. Not that we ever did a particularly good job of it in the West.
Yeah.
But that's just poisoning the discourse so badly that it makes some kind of a negotiated resolution of this war virtually impossible.
Yeah, and not only have we not honored that sacrifice, but immediately following the war, we engaged in this project of importing these Ukrainian former SS members into the country specifically. That's why we have now in Canada these Nazi monuments to these Waffen SS divisions. And I think that's been one thing that's become really, and the more I've learned about this over the last couple of years, because I started paying attention to this a couple of years ago, because of the fact that we had these monuments, I started asking kind of some questions about, what I thought Canada was against fascism and against the Nazis. Why do we have monuments to SS divisions in Canada? You start looking into that, and you realize that it's not quite as simple as the narrative has been as we've been led to believe about our role in the global geopolitics and our role against fascism. I think it's been really alarming when you realize Canada's role in sort of rehabilitating this ultra right wing sort of Ukrainian nationalism. Specifically, you see Chrystia Freeland, that's part of her whole life's work and her whole family's life's work, is this is promoting this very specific vision of right wing Ukrainian anti-Soviet ultranationalism. And Canada has played a really central role in promoting that narrative and instilling that sort of narrative and making sure that when people think of Ukraine, that's what they understand Ukrainians to be, this ultranationalist anti-Soviet people who are against the Russians. And I think it's been Canada's role in being part of that project now. It's since the post-war period has really gone under the radar. And now we see them during this conflict still engaging in that exact same sort of project.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Chrystia Freeland. One of the people I met with before going to Crimea, I met in Moscow with two officials from the Russian Foreign Ministry. I requested that meeting, by the way, and I requested it through the Russian embassy in Ottawa a couple of weeks before my departure, and the ambassador kindly arranged for me to meet with them. And one of them had been a diplomat in the Russian embassy in Ottawa and played a central role in exposing the fact that Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi collaborator, and that she had effectively lied to the Canadian people about him being a champion of democracy, which was how she portrayed him. And the mainstream media at the time, he was expelled. He was expelled by the Canadian government for revealing that truth. And you'd have to believe me, you can find articles at the time. This is obviously well before we got to the stage we're in now in Ukraine, from the mainstream media, including the Toronto Star, where they acknowledged that the reason why the Trudeau government was expelling him was because he revealed the truth about Chrystia Freeland's grandfather. again, like, how are Canadians not deeply troubled by all of this? That somebody like Chrystia Freeland, obviously she's not responsible for her grandfather's atrocious behavior, but somebody who lied about that and then, who undoubtedly played a role in the expulsion of the Russian diplomat who exposed it, actually did a service to Canadians by revealing the truth about her grandfather, that person has a central role in formulating Canadian government policy towards the war in Ukraine. That should be something really disturbing to Canadians. And yet, in the mainstream discourse, no one says boo about this. No one says, maybe Miss Freeland isn't the most objective person. Maybe she should not be having a major say in how we're going to respond to this war.
No, on the contrary, all that information about her grandfather was just kind of hand waved away as being Russian propaganda. And yeah, I agree. People aren't responsible for the actions of their parents or their grandparents, but you are somewhat responsible when you uphold your Nazi grandfather as being this like important inspiration to you, and then you go on carrying on that exact his life's work of promoting this exact kind of like right-wing Ukrainian ethno-nationalism.
Right.
Then you are kind of responsible.
And you smear people who reveal the truth.
That's right.
Totally. It certainly raises questions about your.
I would say so.
Whether you're reliable in terms of a policymaker with respect to this war. But it's a sign of the times in which we live that you get expelled from Canada for revealing facts about the foreign minister at the time, Chrystia Freeland.
Yeah, it does. It does say a lot. And so I wanted to talk about you obviously seem a bit skeptical about, this conflict kind of de-escalating. And I understand your skepticism considering how allergic people are in the West to any conversations about this, about a dialogue or a ceasefire over the last year and a half or so. It does seem like maybe there's starting to be an endpoint in sight, like in terms of the actual military activity that's been going on. There's maybe less of an appetite in certain ruling class circles to continue this endless support. And it may get to a point where they'll be forced to kind of actually go to the negotiating table and figure out, how to move forward and how to have a ceasefire. Which again, I think is a really disturbing thing considering that like these conversations could have been happening a year and a half ago. We're here now in May 2023, and we're heading towards probably the same outcome that would have been reached a year ago with significantly less violence and bloodshed. But because there's just been this endless appetite in the West to just have this nonstop promotion of this conflict, they just refuse to ever entertain this possibility. But do you think we're getting to a point possibly where there might be an off-ramp here to de-escalate and negotiate and maybe start having some real conversations about what Ukraine is going to look like moving forward and how to kind of move past this without escalating it even further into nuclear conflict?
Well, I've been saying for years, have other people, who have a lot more military expertise than I do, people from NATO militaries, that there's virtually no prospect of Ukraine winning this war. Virtually no prospect. And, this was very simply laid out by University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer in a recent talk he gave. And I just watched it last night, actually. I agree with everything he said. I've been saying pretty much the same thing, but not as succinctly as he put it. And he said, look, it's as simple as this. This is a war of attrition that is being waged primarily by means of artillery. That is the way in which the vast majority of the soldiers are being killed and wounded. It's through artillery. According to Western experts, pro-Ukraine Western experts, Russia has had from the very beginning and continues to have a multiple of artillery relative to Ukraine. The estimates range anywhere from 5 to 10 times as much artillery as the Ukrainian military has. And there's no sign of that disparity being narrowed substantially in the months ahead. Absolutely none. And in addition, Russia has a population which, when you take into account the millions of people who have left Ukraine, the millions of military-age men who are no longer there, no longer willing or available to serve, Russia now has a population advantage in the range of 5 to 1. So when you have 5 times as large a population to draw upon to replenish your losses, and the other side has 1/5 to 1/10 the artillery that you have, and you have, and artillery is the main weapon and the main means by which soldiers are being killed and wounded, you have no hope. No hope. Your defeat is an inevitability unless Russia does something colossally stupid, or NATO, God forbid, intervenes massively and directly, in which case we're straight into World War III, and I would say likely a nuclear exchange. Ukraine is doomed. That's all there is to it. I think that there are people in Western governments who now are coming to terms with that, especially after Bakhmut fell. I think it was on May 20th when its fall was formally announced. It's very clear, and you just go back and read Zelensky's statements, his own statements in the weeks leading up to the loss of Bakhmut, that Bakhmut was viewed as being a pivotal battle for the Ukrainian military. It lost decisively, it suffered huge casualties, and there's no reason to think it's going to get better from here. There may be short-term territorial gains of inconsequential pieces of land in the months ahead if Ukraine does in fact launch the much vaunted counteroffensive. But there's absolutely no reason to think that in the longer run, Ukraine can win this war. And I think that there's a growing realization about that in the halls of power in the West. The problem, as I see it, Rob, and I'd love to be wrong about this, but I think that that any proposal that the people who are making the decisions in the West would be prepared to countenance to bring an end to the war will be entirely unacceptable to Russia. So you can forget about, Russia at this stage withdrawing its troops from, Crimea is out of the question, and that was always out of the question. But you might have persuaded Russia before all of this bloodshed to withdraw its troops from one or more of the 4 oblasts that it's annexed. Maybe even all of them, if there was adequate security put in place to protect the Russian speakers in the areas now controlled by Russia. That's not happening now. And I asked people this question over and over and over again when I was in Russia, including people in the Russian government, people in think tanks, people who'd served in the military. Should Russia, in your opinion, give up the territory it now controls? Let's leave out Crimea in order to see a peace deal done, assuming Russia's other demands can be satisfied, including no NATO membership for Ukraine. And the answer I got was uniformly no, absolutely not. In fact, people were worried that the Russian government would do a deal like that. And they were hopeful that the Russian government at the end of the day would say, no, we're not giving up that territory. It's too late now. So is anybody in the West, is there any indication that Biden or Blinken or Nuland or Macron or Scholz or Rishi Sunak or Justin Trudeau or Chrystia Freeland would be willing to sign off on the transfer of essentially that territory that's currently controlled by Russia to the Russian Federation? There's absolutely no sign of that. Absolutely no sign of that. They're not even prepared to, as I haven't seen a single Western leader say openly, even now as things are going into, as the situation for the Ukrainian military is rapidly deteriorating, they don't even seem willing to give up on the idea of Ukrainian membership in NATO. That's like, so from my perspective, I try to be realistic about these things. As much as I'd love to be wrong, I think the only way that we're going to get peace is we have to remove these people from office. That's it. We have to fight, especially the Biden administration, because they're the ones who are really driving this train. This is the conductor of this train, and this train is going off a cliff. And I think those people are going to take us with them. So unless we can find a way to get them out of power and put in power, people who actually see that this is a lost cause, it's going to end in Ukraine's destruction, and it may end in our destruction through a nuclear war. I just don't see a mutually acceptable peace deal being put on the table. God, I hope I'm wrong about that.
And one unfortunate thing, like I was talking about before, is like that getting rid of the Biden administration is one part of that as well. But it's like when you have only right wingers are the only ones that are kind of advancing this argument, it's also creating another dangerous situation where you're empowered, where the right is being even more empowered than it was previously. So it's like there's not a lot of good options here left. Although one kind of interesting thing that I coming up over the last couple of weeks, which I found kind of interesting, is China's increasing role in all this. You've had these constant demands coming from Canada and America and other NATO countries for them to denounce the Russian invasion, which obviously is not something that they're going to do, being a really important ally of Russia right now. But they've also tried to kind of maintain their sort of stance of neutrality and non-interference throughout this whole process. I think they also recognize that while not maybe co-signing everything about the invasion, they do recognize that Russia did have legitimate security concerns in the lead up to this thing. And now they're trying to play this role as kind of international peacekeeper, not only there, but also in Syria, in Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Iran, and even in Israel, Palestine. They're starting to become more implicated. I think that's kind of an interesting phenomenon, given their kind of emerging role in the world as this kind of geopolitical leader in this new kind of multilateral geopolitical reality that's emerging here. And one interesting thing as well is that it seems like there's been even some interest from Zelensky and from the Ukrainians to have them be involved in that process. But then you have their like Western overlords being like, no way, no deal. But what do you think about that prospect of China's kind of emerging role here, and an emerging role basically as a global leader or global peacekeeper?
Well, what China, I mean, I don't think it was just China, but China certainly played an important role in the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I never would have thought in my lifetime I was going to see those two countries essentially enter into an era of détente. But this is a different ball of wax. Where the Ukraine war, there's no question that China's government is very close to the Russian government. It's no question that they are in excellent terms. But the Chinese could mediate a rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians without compromising their own core strategic interests. In fact, their Belt and Road Initiative was facilitated, strengthened by an end of hostilities between Iran. It will be strengthened by an end of hostilities between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's a very important region for that initiative. And peace between those two powers, those two regional powers, will advance that project significantly. When you're talking about Ukraine, however, I think, this is one of the most incoherent things about Western foreign policy, and there's so much about it that's incoherent. At the same time as they're trying to pressure and cajole China into using its power and influence with Russia to bring an end to this war on terms that would be acceptable to the West, they are engaged in unmitigated saber rattling and just neocon hostility and bloodthirsty warmongering against China itself. So China has been driven for its own protection and its own strategic preservation of its own strategic core interests to deepen its ties to Russia. And it knows perfectly well, the Chinese government knows perfectly well, that if the Russian government was destabilized by this war, and a very unsatisfactory outcome to this conflict could very well lead to the destabilization of this Russian government, that would make China more vulnerable. China needs Russia to withstand the pressure of the West, and particularly the immense resources that Russia possesses, and also the technology that Russia possesses, including military technologies, amongst the most advanced in the world. China needs that to withstand the isolation and the weakening that the West wants to inflict upon China. So I don't see China, trying to push, even if it could do so, the Putin government into accepting terms that would potentially destabilize the political situation in Russia. They will certainly, I think they genuinely want to see peace. I think, frankly, the Russian government genuinely wants to see peace, as long as it's on terms which protect the security of the Russian people and which protect the interests of the Russian speakers in, within the 1991 boundaries of Ukraine, and keep, Ukraine out of NATO. I think they want peace, but certainly the Chinese do. But are the Chinese going to do this in a way that is going to jeopardize their strategically important relationship with Russia? I just don't see that happening at all. And the way we're behaving, we're making it a guarantee that ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
The way we're behaving towards China.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, right now, I think the exact same people that threw gasoline on the fire here in Ukraine over the last 10 years are trying to do the exact same thing in Taiwan right now and trying to turn the Taiwanese into a proxy to destabilize China in the exact same way. So if you get their way, they're going to have a completely other front opened up there. And I think one thing China's been very clear on is that they're not going to allow that situation to happen. They're not going to allow Taiwan to be a place where the United States can go in and park missiles and aim missiles at them and continue this kind of like encirclement. This kind of military encirclement is a big factor in both Ukraine and with the situation with China right now as well, right? You have NATO expansion up to Russia's borders, like in violation of the sort of the end of the Soviet Union and the agreements that were made. And you have China, as much as they're framed hilariously as they're framed in our Western media as being like belligerent and aggressive, they are also surrounded and encircled by American military bases in Okinawa and South Korea. And in the south, you've got now AUKUS in the South China Sea and are arming the Australians to promote there. And you have even people in Canada and like in the fucking NDP saying we need to be part of AUKUS. Why aren't we part of AUKUS? Amazingly. And still,
it's just a sick name.
it's really amazing, yeah. And they're despite that obvious security threat that represents to them, everything that they do is framed as being kind of inherently hostile and aggressive. It's completely amazing.
It's surreal. I mean, how many countries has China invaded in the post-World War II period? Who can name a country that China has invaded in the post-World War II period? You know, what is China's military budget compared to the U.S. military budget? It's like a third of its military. How many foreign military bases does China have? I believe it has one in Djibouti.
Yeah.
That's it. Maybe it has a couple of other small bases. The United States has, just the United States, forget about the rest of NATO, has something in the range of 800 foreign military bases. So who is the aggressor? I mean, give me a break. How can anybody view China and the relationship with the West as the aggressive party? You know, and they say, well, China's interfering with, our democratic process.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But first of all, the evidence of that is extraordinarily thin. No one's really put forward a lot of evidence, but real evidence, credible evidence to support the idea that China's government is trying to pervert the course of Canadian democracy. It's
coming directly from our intelligence community, openly, working with their partners in the media.
Yes, these people who lie to courts and secret subpoena applications, like we're going to trust them. I mean, seriously, I don't trust CSIS one iota, and no Canadian should. No Canadian. But let's just suppose that there is something going on there. Okay, let's look at the attempts by Western governments to overthrow democratically elected regimes. Even if it's true that China is engaged in some form of interference covertly in our democracy or other Western democracies, it still pales in comparison to what the United States and Britain and other Western powers have done in the post-World War II period. You know, I mentioned the case of Venezuela as a prop. They actually said that the democratically elected Venezuelan president, Maduro, whatever you may think of him, he was democratically elected, that he's not the president anymore. We in the West are going to decide who the president of the Venezuelan people is. Has China ever done that to any Western country or any other country for that matter? I mean, this is ridiculous to paint them as the aggressor.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems a lot of it too. It's creating this really, I think, toxic climate here. Like the recent accusations that came out with Olivia Chow, who's like as anti-communist as they come, and has taken every opportunity to speak out against China at every chance she's gotten. But some of the criticism was like, oh, she met with this kind of like Chinese cultural group that has basically like pushed back ever so slightly against some of the accusations that we've made about human rights, or, has asked basic questions about the role that Canada has played in perpetuating these conflicts. And so we're creating this climate, I think, for like the Chinese Canadian diaspora in this case, where you're not allowed basically to express any sort of pride in China. You're not allowed to talk about the unprecedented historic development that China has been part of over the last couple of decades. You're not allowed to ask questions about these accusations about human rights or genocide that were hurling at them from our own kind of like settler colonialist graveyard of indigenous people that we live on top of. And And it's like when Chinese people do that, when they express any kind of opinion that's remotely in line with the CPC or the of the CPC, they're framed as being some kind of like devious agents of the state, or it's basically we're creating this climate where there's no legitimate reason for any Chinese person or anyone really to express any sympathy with the Chinese government or to push back on any of our sort of aggression and belligerence. That's the climate that's being created with these kind of accusations.
This is what's happened in Ukraine. In Ukraine, even if you're ethnically Russian, you're a Russian speaker, you've been speaking Russian your entire life, you have family members in Russia, but you're a Ukrainian citizen born, raised there. If you want to have good relations with Russia, you're basically a traitor. They now view you as a traitor. And this is where we're heading with the Chinese people living in the West. Yeah. If, it's a crime to want your country to which you've emigrated to have good relations with the country of your origin, that's a crime. That's a betrayal. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I remember when I was growing up, my parents came from Greece to Canada in the 1950s. They were born and raised in Greece. And I remember when I was growing up, they would say to me, Dimitri, you're a Greek first and you're a Canadian second. Now, that didn't make my parents traitors. I mean, the fact of the matter is my parents still loved Canada. They still were, law-abiding citizens who raised 4 kids here. That didn't make them traitors. I don't, by the way, feel that way myself. I don't feel nationalistic about being Greek or Canadian. I'm a citizen of both countries, and I take my responsibilities as a citizen in both countries seriously. But we've got to the stage where just wanting to have good relations with the country of your origin, if it's deemed to be a geopolitical rival of the United States and its allies, that constitutes, it's almost tantamount to treason. It's an absurdly dangerous position to be in, and this could end up causing a lot of difficulty for the Chinese people, Canadians of Chinese origin.
Yeah, and I think you hit it as well when you talk about which country has the influence over the Canadian government. It's not China, it's the United States government. Like, we're the ones that are basically a junior partner in this global imperialist project. Yeah. We take our cues from the U.S. State Department about these foreign policy issues. But this is never discussed. We're worried
about Chinese interference when our foreign policy has basically been outsourced to Washington.
Yeah, it's
it would be comical if it weren't so ridiculous. But
Well, listen, Dimitri, we've been talking for a while. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know it's getting late there. I mentioned your efforts to run for the leadership of the Green Party. I was just wondering if before we sign off, you could just talk a little bit about that experience and how that went for you, and the kind of the level of hostility that there was within that kind of structure to your sort of foreign policy views, and whether you are continuing to engage with the Green Party or whether you have any future plans to run for anything. I was just wondering if you could just get your perspective on that. I'd be interested to hear about it.
Well, as you know, Rob, there were 8 candidates. It was a ranked ballot. I finished second with about 45% of the vote. And at every step of the way, the former leader, Elizabeth May, who had vowed on national television at the time that she resigned in 2019, that she had to remain, these were her words, completely neutral in the leadership contest. At every step of the way, publicly and privately, she fought tooth and nail to undermine my campaign. She tried to keep me out of the contest. When they let me in over her vigorous objections, she tried to get me thrown out right up until the last week of the race. And as the voting was going on, Elizabeth May and the eventual winner, Annamie Paul, spoke to Global News in what can only be described as a hit piece against me, which is based upon my support for the Palestinian people and my criticism of, advocates for Israel in Canada. And that was a weapon that was used against me relentlessly, was my criticisms of Israel, its supporters in Canada, and my defense of the Palestinian people. And to be honest with you, Rob, I mean, on the one hand, it was inspiring and moving that we managed to bring together so many people from the progressive community, many of whom, like you, were not traditional supporters of the Green Party, and come so close to winning. But I have to tell you, man, the day that I lost, I was very relieved because what I experienced, during those 8 months took a big toll on me, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. When it came around to 2022, I thought very, very long and hard about running again. And be honest with you, it actually, like, I thought I was going to get an ulcer just thinking about it. It caused me so much stress just thinking about going through that again. And ultimately, one of the things which caused me to decide not to do it was, in fact, this war in Ukraine. And I wrote about this. I published a statement on my website in March of last year after making the decision. This was a month after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And one reason I cited for deciding not to run was I was going to be met yet again with the implacable hostility of Elizabeth May. And I'd had enough of that. And another reason I quoted was, and this is something that I believe this more today than I believed it even then. And that is that if I had run, I would have had to shut my mouth about this war. It's so politically, radioactive to take the positions that I have taken with respect to this war at this time, that, either I was going to have to shut up, which I couldn't do as a matter of conscience, or I was going to have, I was just going to get savaged in the media and by people within the Green Party, frankly, who have been duped by the pro-NATO propaganda, and I would have no chance of winning. So what was the whole point? I'm not willing to shut up about it. Talking the truth would have destroyed any chance of winning the leadership contest. So I just decided, this is a pointless exercise.
Well,
the last thing I want to say about the future, just to close it out, you asked me about that. I mean, I can't see myself running to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada again. I wouldn't, and I'm not trying to be coy here. I wouldn't rule it out. If circumstances are such that it seems to me to be the best way for me to contribute in whatever way I can to the betterment of our world and our society, then I would think about it again. But it's really hard for me to imagine that at this stage, especially with Elizabeth May still there. I just think that that's just a prescription for misery.
Yeah. It doesn't seem like they have much interest in like growing the party at all or really challenging power in any way. It's just become this kind of like personal little fiefdom for Elizabeth May. It's great work if you can get it, but if you actually care about changing things, it doesn't seem to be a really a positive avenue for accomplishing that from my perspective. But Dimitri, I really appreciate you taking the time to come exactly. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to me on the show. It's been fantastic to connect with you over this stuff. Looking forward to seeing what the future holds, and you're welcome to come back anytime and chat about this stuff. And thanks again. Thanks for joining us.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me. And again, I cannot thank you enough for being willing to talk honestly, openly, and intelligently about this war. We desperately need more people like you out there. Honestly, thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, it's my pleasure. So we'll talk soon. Take care.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.